Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources, things like clinical neurology texts, emergency medicine research, and some pretty advanced neuroimaging studies.
Yeah, it's a great collection of data.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to show you exactly how doctors act as, like, medical detectives in the emergency room. We're going to look at how they use advanced imaging to literally see bleeding caught mid-motion and how they decode the brain's own chemistry to act as this built-in forensic clock.
It is a perfect example of how modern medicine has to pivot from looking at the human body as a static picture, to viewing it as a dynamic, unfolding crime scene.
Right. And to set that scene for you, we have a very specific clinical scenario straight from our sources. So imagine a patient is rushed into the hospital with an intracranial hemorrhage, an ICH.
Right, a severe brain bleed.
Exactly. So they're stabilized, they get put into bed. But 6 hours into her hospital stay, her right-sided weakness suddenly worsens. Her level of consciousness drops, and she becomes incredibly drowsy.
Which is terrifying for the family and the staff.
Yeah, totally. But the medical staff didn't witness any new event. Like, there was no seizure, no obvious secondary trauma, no cardiac arrest. So the mystery is, what just happened in that 6-hour window?
Which is the kind of scenario that immediately puts an entire medical team into this highly compressed decision-making matrix. Because the initial instinctual assumption in that high-pressure environment is often that lightning just struck twice.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the basics of what an ICH actually looks like when it first comes through those ER doors.
Yeah.
What are the doctors looking at before the patient even gets to that 6-hour mark?
Well, when an intracranial hemorrhage presents, clinicians are generally looking at two separate but, overlapping components of symptoms. First, you have the symptoms that reflect raised intracranial pressure.
Because the skull is basically a closed box, right?
Exactly. You have to remember the strict physics of the skull. It is a rigid, closed box. It does not expand. So when you introduce a foreign volume of blood into that closed system, the global pressure goes up.
And that increased pressure is what manifests as the severe headaches and the vomiting.
Yes, and crucially, depressed consciousness. So that is the first component. The second component is location-specific symptoms.
Meaning where the bleed actually is in the brain.
Right. Depending on the exact coordinates of where that blood is pooling in the brain tissue, you might see right-sided weakness or sudden loss of speech or specific visual field deficits.
Now, out of all those symptoms, our sources make a definitive point about that depressed consciousness. The drowsiness our mystery patient was experiencing at the 6-hour mark. Why is that specific symptom isolated as such a massive red flag?
Because it is arguably your most vital clinical clue. The frequency of general pressure symptoms, like a headache, well, that can vary wildly from patient to patient.
Oh, I see. So headaches aren't reliable.
Not entirely, but there's a massive, incredibly reliable correlation between depressed consciousness and the actual physical volume of the hematoma. This holds true across almost every anatomical location in the brain.
Wow, really? So it doesn't matter where it is.
Right. If the consciousness is dropping, the mass is likely growing. And that specific correlation is what directly predicts mortality.
So it's a direct mechanical relationship, which I guess brings us to the big reveal for our patient's mystery.
Yeah.
Her sudden deterioration wasn't a second stroke. It wasn't a secondary complication from a medication. It was this phenomenon called hematoma expansion.
Which represents a massive historical shift in how we understand intracranial hemorrhage. For a long time, a hematoma was viewed as a static event. The vessel burst, the clot formed, the damage was done, and now you just manage the fallout.
Right, like a puddle on the floor from a spilled cup. Drop the cup, the mess is there, and now it's just about cleaning it up or, I don't know, waiting for it to dry.
Exactly. That was the old thinking.
But hematoma expansion sounds less like a static puddle and more like a pipe that is actively still leaking behind the drywall. Like it's pushing back against the drywall, right?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, understanding that distinction is a fundamental paradigm shift in treating these patients. It is not a puddle, it is a leaking pipe.
Oh, it's still going.
Yes. The worsening is purely mechanical in that acute phase. It is the original bleed continuing to grow, taking up more physical space, and exerting this crushing pressure on critical, life-sustaining brain structures.
I'm trying to visualize the scale of this, though. Like, how common is it for that pipe to keep leaking after they arrive at the hospital?
The numbers in the clinical texts are staggering, honestly. Between 28% and 38% of patients who present within 3 hours of symptom onset will experience hematoma expansion.
Wait, over a third of patients?
Yeah.
And how much extra blood are we talking about? Is it just slowly seep a few extra drops, or?
No, it's much more dramatic. Serial CT scans show that in severe cases, the bleed grows by more than 300% of its original volume.
Wait, 300%? In a closed box?
Yes, in a closed box.
That means you come into the hospital, you are already in a neurological crisis, and the physical mass causing that crisis could quadruple in size while you were literally lying in the observation bed.
Which perfectly explains the progressive deterioration of our mystery patient. The brain tissue is quite literally being compressed out of the way to make room for that 300% increase in blood volume.
So if I am the ER doctor and I have a waiting room full of patients, my absolute top priority is figuring out whose pipe is still leaking. How do clinicians know which patients are in that 38% risk group?
Well, they rely on several highly reliable clinical predictors. First is a high baseline volume of the bleed when they first arrive.
So if it's big to start with.
Exactly. Simply put, a massive initial rupture often indicates a higher mechanical propensity to keep bleeding. Second, they check for the use of antiplatelets or anticoagulants.
Because if the patient is on blood thinners, the body's natural drywall patch, the clotting cascade, just can't form properly to plug the leak.
Precisely, it keeps slowing. But the third predictor is fascinating because it feels entirely counterintuitive.
Okay, what is it?
It's a very short time, from symptom onset to the baseline CT scan.
Hold on. The faster a patient gets to the hospital and gets scanned, the higher the statistical risk that their brain bleed will expand. That goes against literally everything we are taught about stroke and emergency medicine. Fast response is supposed to be better.
And fast response is infinitely better for the patient's overall survival because it allows for early intervention. But think about the mechanical timeline of an active leak.
Okay, I'm with you.
If you scan someone just 30 minutes after they collapse, you are catching the pathology at the absolute beginning of the bleeding process. There is simply a lot more time left on the biological clock for that active bleeding to continue.
Oh, I see. I get it. If someone isn't discovered and scanned until, 12 hours after their symptoms started and they are still alive, the biological window for active explosive expansion has likely already closed.
Exactly. The clot has finally formed.
The damage is done, but it's stable.
Right. So the earlier you catch them, the more potential time remains for the bleed to grow. But clinicians don't just have to guess based on those timeline predictors. We actually have imaging technology that can catch the leak red-handed.
And this brings us to the spot sign.
Yes, the spot sign.
The sources isolate the spot sign as genuinely central to modern risk stratification. Describe what a doctor is actually looking for on the screen here.
What's fascinating here is how incredibly literal the diagnostic image is. When we do a CT angiogram in those first few acute hours, we inject an iodine-based contrast dye into the patient's bloodstream.
Right, to light up the vessels.
Yes. The scanner picks up that dye to light up the vascular highway of the brain. And if a patient is actively bleeding, the doctor will see a tiny bright fleck of that contrast dye sitting right inside the dark pooling mass of the hematoma.
So they are literally seeing a single drop of active ongoing bleeding caught mid-motion by the scanner.
It is contrast dye escaping the ruptured vessel in real time, and the predictive weight of finding that single bright pixel is immense.
Give me the numbers.
If the spot sign is present on the scan, it correlates with subsequent hematoma enlargement in up to 77% of patients.
77%. Wow. And if they don't have that tiny bright spot,
The risk drops to between 4% and 22%.
that is a staggering diagnostic pivot based on one visual cue.
Yeah.
You can imagine the tension in the radiology room, staring at a screen, hunting for one tiny pixel of white dye that decides whether this patient is rushed to an emergency craniotomy or just, monitored in the ICU.
It's incredibly high stakes.
Oh, wait, you're relying on a perfect high-resource scenario. A patient lands in a Tier 1 trauma center, an advanced CT angiogram is ready, and they can safely receive intravenous contrast dye. What happens at, a rural urgent care at 3 a.m. with just a standard non-contrast CT scanner? Are those doctors just flying blind?
They absolutely are not, and this is where radiologic interpretation becomes an incredible art form.
Okay, how so?
Well, without contrast dye, you cannot see the active mid-motion leak. But you can look for mechanical markers of mixed-density blood. For instance, there's the swirl sign.
What exactly is swirling? I mean, blood is just blood, isn't it?
Not once it leaves the vessel.
Yeah.
When blood pools in the brain, it immediately starts to coagulate and change density. Fresh, actively leaking liquid blood has a totally different radiologic density than blood that has been sitting there clotting for 3 hours.
Oh, that makes sense.
So the swirl sign is a literal swirling pattern of those differing densities on the scan. It represents a chaotic mixture of fresh liquid blood actively churning into older clotting blood.
So even without the dye, the physical turbulence of the leak leaves a signature.
Yes, exactly. There is also the satellite sign, which is seeing small, separate foci of hemorrhage floating slightly apart from the main mass, or the blend sign, where you see adjacent regions of totally different densities just settling against each other.
Are these non-contrast markers as reliable as the spot sign? Or is relying on a swirl or a satellite pattern basically like reading medical tea leaves?
They require more subjective interpretation by the radiologist, certainly. They aren't as definitively binary as the contrast spot sign. However, they are far from tea leaves. They are physical, thermodynamic evidence of heterogeneous bleeding. For lower resource centers, these signs offer a genuinely critical distress signal that the hematoma is unstable.
Okay, so CT scans, whether you are hunting for the high-definition contrast spot sign or the non-contrast swirl, they are brilliant at showing us the present. Like, they show us the physics of what is happening right this second.
Correct.
But what if a patient arrives at the ER, they live alone, and nobody has any idea when the symptoms actually started? The entire timeline predictor we talked about just goes out the window. How do doctors look into the past?
That is where the diagnostic pathway pivots completely away from CT scans, and we have to turn to MRI.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I want to look at how the brain essentially dates its own injuries. It's like leaving a piece of iron out in the rain, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
If you find a piece of metal in the woods, you don't need to know the exact day it was dropped there. You just measure the amount of rust on it, and the rust tells you the timeline. The hemoglobin inside our blood is literally rusting inside the brain, and the MRI is acting as a highly calibrated rust detector.
That is a remarkably accurate mechanistic way to think about it. We are tracking the chemical degradation of hemoglobin, the iron-rich protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen.
But how does a decaying blood cell actually change the physical signal on a giant magnetic scanner? Like, how does that work?
It comes down to the subatomic state of that iron. As a hematoma sits in the brain tissue, the hemoglobin undergoes a rigidly staged sequence of chemical transformations.
Okay.
And because each stage changes the molecular structure of the iron, it uniquely distorts the magnetic field of the MRI. It functions exactly like a built-in biological clock, and it plays out in 5 distinct phases.
Walk us through the mechanics of this forensic countdown. What is phase 1?
Phase 1 is the first few hours. This is oxyhemoglobin. The blood is fresh, oxygenated, just like it is in your healthy arteries.
So it's perfectly normal blood at that point.
Yes. And because the iron is bound to oxygen, it doesn't heavily disrupt the MRI's magnetic field.
So in phase 1, the MRI essentially sees it as normal, fresh blood. What triggers phase 2?
Over the next few hours to days, the trapped blood consumes its remaining oxygen and becomes deoxyhemoglobin. This is where the rusting concept really comes in.
Ah, because the oxygen is gone.
Right. Without oxygen, unpaired electrons on the iron atom are exposed. These unpaired electrons are highly magnetic. They aggressively distort the local magnetic field of the scanner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this creates rapid signal dephasing, which causes the hemorrhage to show up markedly dark on a specific MRI view called a T2 weighted image.
So the loss of oxygen exposes the iron fights the magnet, and the image turns dark. The chemical clock is ticking.
Yeah.
What happens in phase 3?
Phase 3 hits within the first few days. The iron oxidizes further, changing its physical structure again to become intracellular methemoglobin.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but this new molecular shape interacts differently with surrounding water protons. This specific dipole interaction suddenly causes the blood to appear glaringly bright on a different scan, the T1 weighted image.
Dark to bright, just comes on how the iron is mutating. That's incredible.
Exactly. Then, phase 4 spans from several days out to months. The red blood cells themselves finally die and rupture, spilling their contents.
Okay, so the cells are breaking open.
Yes, this is extracellular methemoglobin. Because the methemoglobin is no longer trapped inside a cell membrane, its magnetic effect shifts again, and it becomes markedly bright on both T1 and T2 MRI views.
So the radiologist is literally just reading a magnetic light board, watching the cellular structure collapse in real time.
Yes. And finally, phase 5. From several days onward, lasting indefinitely, the body's immune system scavenges that broken down blood and turns it into ferritin and hemosiderin.
What are those?
These are essentially concentrated clumps of iron. They are superparamagnetic, meaning they distort the magnetic field so violently that they show up as a permanent pitch-black scar on the scans forever.
Oxyhemoglobin. The oxyhemoglobin, intra- and extracellular methemoglobin. And finally, the permanent black scar of hemosiderin. It's an elegant, inescapable chemical countdown.
And because this sequence is so rigidly tied to basic human biochemistry, a radiologist can estimate the age of the hemorrhage just from looking at that magnetic signal pattern.
Which is wild.
It is routinely more accurate than a family's frantic, trauma-clouded memory of when they think they first noticed a symptom.
That level of precision is incredible. But when neurologists are looking at these highly sensitive MRIs, are there other clues hidden in the brain tissue? Like, does the scanner pick up anything unexpected?
It does, and this is where the diagnostic lens widens significantly. When scanning these ICH patients, radiologists consistently notice that about 25% of them, 1 in 4, showed tiny punctate, hyperintense lesions on diffusion-weighted imaging located far away from the main hematoma.
Wait, if I'm looking at an MRI of a brain bleed, and I suddenly see a dozen tiny bright lesions scattered all over the rest of the healthy brain, my first instinct is that the patient's heart is throwing a shower of tiny blood clots, like a massive embolic event on top of the bleed.
And that is exactly the clinical trap. That assumption would lead a medical team to initiate a massive, time-consuming cardiac workup.
Right.
They would start hunting for a structural heart defect or an arrhythmia while the patient is sitting there with a bleeding brain.
But the sources suggest the heart isn't the culprit here.
It really is in this specific presentation. The data shows these remote lesions usually represent tiny ischemic strokes, or in some cases, the MRI signature of microscopic hematomas caught in that extracellular methemoglobin stage.
So they're older, microscopic injuries. What is causing them, if not the heart?
They reflect advanced underlying small vessel disease. This is a massive insight for long-term patient care. It tells the physician that the massive hemorrhage they are treating right now isn't an isolated accident. The entire vascular network of the patient's brain, the microvessels, the capillaries, is deeply fragile and diseased.
So the main hemorrhage was just the biggest pipe that finally burst.
Exactly. But those tiny spots prove that the entire plumbing system behind the drywall is profoundly compromised.
Which completely changes how you manage that patient's recovery and their future risk.
Yeah.
You aren't just patching one hole. You have to treat a systemic microvascular failure.
Exactly. It saves the team from chasing a cardiac ghost and focuses their therapeutic efforts directly back on managing the intense fragility of the brain's blood vessels.
Which brings us right back to the immediate crisis of our clinical mystery.
Huh.
Our patient who worsened at the 6-hour mark. Her doctors didn't assume she had a sudden secondary stroke. They didn't assume she had an invisible seizure. They took her immediately down for a repeat CT scan.
And that repeat scan confirmed genuine hematoma expansion. The 300% volume increase mechanism we discussed was actively playing out, compressing her brain tissue and dropping her consciousness.
It wasn't lightning striking twice in the same place.
Right.
It was the same fire, aggressively spreading.
And this raises an important question about human psychology and emergency medicine. In the literature, this is often referred to as the common mistake.
The common mistake.
Yes. When a patient with a known brain bleed suddenly gets worse hours later, there is a very human cognitive tendency to assume it must be a completely new, discrete event.
Because to the nurses and doctors standing at the bedside, it feels new. I mean, the patient was awake and talking an hour ago, and now they're unresponsive.
Precisely. The external presentation is abrupt, so we assume the internal cause is abrupt. But understanding the silent mechanical physics of hematoma expansion offers a far more statistically common and, frankly, far more directly treatable explanation.
Because if you think it's a seizure...
If an ER team assumes the deterioration is a seizure, they might administer anti-epileptic medications and simply wait for the patient to wake up.
Which is bad.
Very bad. If they understand it is hematoma expansion, they take immediate, aggressive physical action. They drastically lower the blood pressure, they rapidly reverse any blood thinners, and they urgently consult neurosurgery to physically open the skull and relieve the pressure. Missing this elegant, real-time physiological process because of information overload in a chaotic ER can easily cost a patient their life.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive? It means that the human body isn't a static machine that simply breaks and patiently waits to be fixed. It is a constantly active, fiercely dynamic environment. The medical teams treating these emergencies aren't just looking at structural damage on a static photograph, they are racing against ongoing physical processes. They are hunting for the spot sign to catch active bleeding mid-drop before the mass quadruples in size.
And they are reading the subatomic degradation of iron and hemoglobin to peer into the biological past, proving that the body always keeps the score, mapping its own trauma even when our memories completely fail us.
Which leaves me with a final lingering thought for you to chew on. We just explored how the decaying iron inside a brain bleed acts as such a precise chemical clock. A clock so mechanically reliable that a doctor can use its magnetic signature to override a family's flawed memory of when symptoms actually started. It really makes you wonder, what other hidden, silent chemical clocks are currently ticking away in our bodies right now? What other molecules are slowly changing shape, just waiting for the right type of spanner or the right medical detective to decode our true biological history? We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.